Welcome to Season 2 of the Cryptopulse podcast, your ultimate guide to the world of crypto, Bitcoin, and world economics. We're here to guide you through the crypto universe with thought-provoking topics, in-depth knowledge, and information to help you make informed decisions. We'll also be interviewing some of the best minds in the industry, such as CEOs of crypto projects, traders, economists, authors, and development teams from around the globe. And now for the episode.
David, welcome to Cryptopulse. And for our listeners today, this is quite unique because we're speaking to both Davids from Naoris Protocol that are in the same room together and have the same first name. So we have David Carvalho, the founder and CEO, and David Holtzman, who's the CTO. So gentlemen, welcome to the show. Before we dive into what you're creating, maybe you wanted to take turns in just introducing yourselves and explain a little bit of your background and how you got into the Web3 and crypto space.
Okay, so I'll start. My name is David Carvalho. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I have been an ethical hacker for 22 years now. And I have been chief of security of a number of multi-billion-dollar companies, both in Europe and also in the UK, mainly in regulated spaces, some of them with hundreds of thousands of people, in many companies, sometimes hundreds of companies in the group. I also advise a number of nation states that are part of the NATO umbrella on cyber war, cyber terrorism, and cyber espionage. They're also European Union members. I sit in a number of boards on on various countries in the European Union regarding intelligence, smart cities, threat management, and areas like that. And I have been involved in the blockchain space for the best part of 9-10 years now. Both as a developer, how can I say, an innovator, and yeah, this is pretty much the context that I bring.
9 or 10 years makes you an industry veteran, I would add.
Well, the space is not that long, so it's a year in this space is almost like geological time.
Right, absolutely. Other David, over to you. Just a quick intro from you would be amazing.
I have a different background, so I go back quite a long ways in technology. Formerly, I was an intelligence agent and a cryptographer for the U.S. Navy and the National Security Agency, and that was fun. Then I got to deal with large data and cryptography, and then had a number of other jobs. I ran the domain name system for 4 or 5 years during Y2K, and I built the domain name registration system that ICANN's still using.
Wow.
I was the chief scientist in the IBM Internet Information Group and built their digital rights management system and the search engine for Lotus Notes. And then I ran research at Booz Allen and Hamilton and helped them with large-scale information systems. And I've done a whole lot of other things, but I wrote a couple of books on privacy and security. So for the last 6-7 years, I've been doing blockchain work too. I'm not the CTO, I'm an advisor, but I've been CTO in a whole lot of other companies. And the thing that interested me the most about this is I'm a huge fan of decentralized anything. And it just politically, technically, it seems like that's where things are going. And what they're doing, bringing DeFi to security is just fascinating. And it feels like it's a wave of the future.
Yeah, we always say that we feel like we're at the start of the .com era all over again in terms of a technology cycle and a political, social, and economic cycle. So, Ben, I'll let you get a word in edgeways now. So,
thanks very much. Yeah, well, I think it's safe to say between you know a thing or two about cybersecurity. It would be great to just hear a little bit more about what you guys are building and just to talk us through the kind of problems that you're solving.
Sure. So I'll give you a little bit of context. So as a chief of security, and I think all my peers that run a complex organization that's distributed across the world, across clouds, on-premise, you name it, have a unique problem that is very sticky, which is it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it and how many tools you throw at it, you still know that you're just this X amount of time away from a major breach. And that comes from, it's just a factoid, let's say. It comes from a principle that the fact is that every device in the world, it doesn't matter what it is, if it's a computer or a phone or a server or whatever, or an IoT device or a smart system, like a smart car or whatever, is a point of failure towards the network it resides on, right? So as an attacker can leverage any of these devices to take over potentially a network and then move laterally across the organization and take over other networks and the organization itself, right? Either through ransomware, which is extremely popular because cryptography is close to mathematically perfect and really hard to break if you're the guy that's on the wrong side of it, all the way to just exfiltration of information, intelligence, IP theft, espionage, you name it, right? So armed with this problem, we went to a bunch of, I was very active on the speaking circuits in cybersecurity, mainly in Europe. And so I went to, I was still in my last position in the UK. And I was basically asking regulators and critical infrastructure environments and in other critical spaces if they cared about changing their cybersecurity approach fundamentally by adopting nascent emerging technology. And these spaces, they tend to be very aware of their risks. So they basically said yes. Yeah, we are open to whatever. So we went into as part of my advisory roles. I had a very good friend, the former chief of intelligence of NATO, which became one of our ambassador at the time of the company, Mr. Kjellgren Hagen, a Norwegian general, that was extremely open to the idea of changing a space fundamentally that is known to be broken in some ways due to its complexity and the threats that are out there. And it was floated in a meeting that we had in Oslo at that time in Norway, between myself, him, and other people that were in charge of cybersecurity across various countries. It would be extremely interesting to use blockchain technology and smart contracts and consensus mechanisms to basically distribute the validation of security across networks. In other words, just because you have a space that's less secure, or you have more devices on a space, it shouldn't mean that all the other devices are actually more vulnerable, and we could instead use that as a leverage for benefit for all of them. So really, from that point on, we decided to it was almost like convergent evolution, like different people thinking similar ideas in different locations at different time. And it was for us an important point for us to start and gather a number of developers and join a number of accelerators. So we ended up applying for the top 20 accelerators in the world. We ended up joining 12 and winning 8 of them. Many of them nation-state accelerators and in spaces that have nothing to do with us, like fintech and other spaces. But of course, the use case is transversal. Having said that, what the protocol does is it transforms traditional points of failure, siloed machines, systems, processes into nodes that are part of the blockchain and are directly connected to our consensus mechanism. That's called DPoSec, distributed proof of security, that allows for them to communicate and validate together, where before they didn't validate at all, if they are trusted, if they are in a secure state, so that they can continue to operate and generate data that's good or known to be good, let's say. So this pretty much flips the principle. Normally, the more devices you have in any network or group of networks, the more vulnerable this is. You increase the surface of risk of these environments. And under our approach, because all of them act as validator nodes, they all act as watchdogs towards each other. They're all connected at a different layer, a peer-to-peer layer, that only cares about trust and resilience between them. So the more you have, what you have is more resilience instead of more risk.
So it's completely the flip of what exists at the moment, really. So an organization that has, 1,000 devices, they have, I guess, from my non-technical layman's perspective, they have more points of entry, more points of penetration. But you're saying that these things that are risk items actually become part of a army of soldiers to protect the rest of the devices.
And this breaks a bad trend, right? And Dave was talking about IoT and all these other things. I mean, the more the ecosystems now of connected devices have become so long and complex, and any one point is the failure point. I mean, the weakest link becomes the thing that takes everything down. And the problem from a company's viewpoint or an enterprise viewpoint is you don't actually control all of those links. So you're at the mercy of too many people. And when you look at the state of security in different vendors and different companies, some of them are very good, some of them are very bad. And most of the IoT devices, just to use that as an example, they have virtually no security people at all on a full-time basis. So they build security into something when they distribute it at first, and then they don't upgrade it. They don't maintain it, maybe once, but we're talking all kinds of devices. So this leads to a situation today where most security problems are not caused by the end user. It's caused by somebody in the middle of the chain who gets a data breach for one reason or the other. And strategy does a very nice job of containing that.
It's interesting how quickly companies move to kind of bolster their security once they've had a breach. Uber is a great example. I mean, they had a staggering cyber attack, I think, just a couple of months back, where I think they got sort of their hands on most of the sort of major systems within Uber. But I mean, with what you guys are building, who is your target market? Who are you sort of pitching this product for?
Well, that's a very good question. And let me just kind of like speak very quickly on the situation of Uber. Uber is a good example, right? They have a huge infrastructure, both on-premise, on a bunch of clouds. And don't forget, their infrastructure includes devices like this, right? Everybody's...
I was just going to ask, is every driver a risk in terms of like a penetration point because they have the app?
Could be. They could be. Yeah, they might be. Yeah.
They were certainly the ones who got hurt. The drivers got worse than the consumers did.
It's the fallout, really. I mean, from a reputation perspective, a breach is basically, business that doesn't happen into the future because your reputation is damaged. It's very hard to recuperate in certain ways unless you are a very sticky, vendor, let's say, or provider. Having said that, investors care about this very much. But in the case of Uber, there was other problems like, for example, there was, in the context of the breach, there were things that were not revealed. So they were known to be there, and by law, they should have been revealed, and they weren't. So there's other issues. But in the example of, what spaces are we catering to? This is quite interesting. It's an interesting question. So there's like two main areas. And first, I want to speak about how cybersecurity happens today. Cybersecurity happens today from an up-down perspective. So you're an organization, it's mandated by the board or the chief security, and systems are installed into, applications are installed for security, firewalls, whatever, are installed in a bunch of devices, endpoint protection, you name it, right? And really our approach is two-pronged. Since we are a distributed system as a protocol, we use blockchain methods to achieve the objectives that we want. We are not really limited by hierarchy. So everybody can really benefit everyone else. So it's a win-win environment. So the thing is, we target companies and organizations that are quite complex. And the more regulated they are, the more, I'm talking about like critical infrastructure, defense, national environments, or highly regulated spaces like banking and finance and ports and rail and things like that, healthcare. So any space that cares about their data or their processes very much is in that understands their risks, which right now are huge, and they are equivalent to the size of their infrastructure. The bigger they are, the more risks they have. Is a natural target. But also from another perspective, this is really for everyone. So what we want to do in the medium-term future is not just have an enterprise approach, but because we are a protocol, what we want is to distribute ourselves as much as possible. So we want to allow people to install on their devices our daemon. So they become a node, and they become a validator node for any other part of the network, really. And this pretty much flips security in another way. So it becomes almost bottom up. So you would have potentially armies, quote, quote, of users with their devices, their phones, with their laptops, you name it, basically validating validations of security and trust of potentially companies and other users, while getting the benefit themselves that their device is no longer siloed, right? It's no longer alone. You have actually, let's call it a global supercomputer of trust, or a hive mind of trust, let's say, that validates them from outside in, so they are no longer alone, and they validate others, and they provide potential intelligence on potential threats to others. So it becomes a very democratic, naturally distributed system. And now going back to the example of Uber, which is an enterprise, obviously, the interesting thing is that they are already distributed. So they have users that are distributed all over the world, their infrastructure is distributed all over the world, but they are applying centralized solutions to a distributed system. And this is naturally doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's the current situation that exists. So our objective is really to fundamentally flip the script, and we do it in a way that, and I want to be very clear, we don't compete with any traditional system of security. I think it should stay there. People still should have all the things that they have. But what we are is really a new layer, so an extra layer, which is a distributed layer of validation that validates everything that is running on, the machines, the hardware itself, the firmware, the running processes, the system, and making sure that it is known to be trusted in its secure state, without competing with anything else that's there. They're doing their thing, we're doing our thing, and really we're adding on to anything that's happening there, of course, mitigating decentralized risks.
What's really brilliant about your protocol is it has that network effect, Metcalfe's law. So the more people that are on the network, the more valuable it is. And I can see how something like this could grow exponentially. How does the financial and tokenomics aspect of this work? So I'm guessing, do people get rewarded for being a node, or how talk to us about sort of the business, if you like, behind the concept?
Thank you. Actually, there's more than one vertent of business, let's say. So there's quote unquote the traditional approach to enterprise security, which is a kind of a business, and then there is the protocol itself, right? So if you think, say, for example, about Ethereum is worth probably I don't know, I haven't checked, but probably around $100 billion, something like that. They don't have any product. They just do blockchain transactions, right? So in our model, as a protocol, we are not very dissimilar from it, but we are focused only on security, and we can work and interoperate with any other chain or without any chain because we make our own and we have our own, and really every environment has their own private chain, right? So they manage their own infrastructure, they see their own transactions, nobody else does, unless they're actually checking for the integrity of this transaction, making sure they're fine and everything is known to be trusted, etc. So basically, every person, every device really becomes a potential validator node on the ecosystem. So every device that joins the protocol has the possibility, depending on the pretty much similar to a proof of stake principle but we have our own consensus mechanism that's fundamentally different, focused only on security and assurance and maintaining resilience. That every time a validation happens, the system needs to be validated for security or trust or whatever. It creates what we call a machine economy. So these machines are basically communicating between them, and as validations happen and validators are selected to, or randomly selected to validate, they receive a payment in our reserve cryptocurrency called Cyber. So there is an incentive to participate on these, how can I say, cybersecurity as a service that everybody will be providing to everyone just by holding a device. Of course, in the background, this happens in the background. The user doesn't really need to interact with it. But the machines are actually the ones that are moving the token between them. So you don't really need user interaction for this. Of course, the token still works pretty much like any other protocol token, in the sense that you can use it for other things. But this is the fundamental use case that normally needs a human for interaction. In this case, it doesn't. The machines just push and pull tokens between themselves as validations occur.
Yeah, let me add two things on that. One is, and it's not obvious perhaps, but the validators don't have to be on the same network as the thing that is validating. That's a really important point. So as this network of networks starts getting bigger and bigger, the validation could happen through two completely disparate random networks, and one validates the other, and then the tokenomics kicks in and incentivizes them, which I think is quite smart. And then the other aspect I just wanted to make sure we threw in there is this will also be backfittable for Web 2 apps. It's not just Web 3.
Oh, yeah. Normally, blockchain-related projects, and especially protocols, let's just go back a little. So there's like 35,000 cryptos out there, more or less. And there's really 4 protocols or 5. And these protocols are all competing with each other, doing the same thing, faster or cheaper. We're not competing with any of them. So that's on the Web3 side. We can operate with Web3 or Web 2. But let's just take a step back, because everything is Web 2. Even Web 3 is Web 2. So Web 3 is still running on servers, running on processes, and inherits all the risk of Web 2 anyway. So if you think even about DeFi, decentralized finance, that, if you look at all the bridges that are, worth like, $25 billion, in the last year, or since the beginning of DeFi, about $12.5 billion were stolen. Now, this is obviously no good, but most of these risks don't come from the blockchain itself. Blockchain is actually quite resilient cryptographically, et cetera, to attacks, even though there are some problems. And we have mitigated some of these problems, because remember, these actually started from a defense critical infrastructure perspective. So there was a certain pedigree that had to exist there compared to other chains. But what I wanted to say there is that the validators themselves occur or can exist in any environment. Doesn't matter if it's a Web 2 or a Web 3 environment. So a Web 2 environment, and let me just underline what that means, and Web 3. So Web 3 is everything related to blockchains, right? Anything related to blockchain or a DApp, centralized application or something like that, that's Web 3, right? DeFi, et cetera, et cetera. And then Web 2 is like 99.5% of the world. Right? It's your nuclear power stations, it's your defense environment, right. It's government, it's voting, it's transportation, it's taxes, it's banking, it's everything, right? And blockchain projects normally cater to Web 3, which is the 0.5%, which it's exciting and it's growing very fast. We cater to both, but mainly Web 2, because that's where we see the biggest impact. What we do really is we come to Web 2, which are centralized systems by default, and we create these peer-to-peer networks that David was talking about that allow them to be decentralized from a perspective of trust and security. So, and that's fundamental, because anything that doesn't have trust and security by default is just doomed to fail. And right now, really, no one, nowhere in any network really knows that they can trust that network and that they can trust those systems and that they can trust their processes. They don't know that for a fact. We allow for, let's say, a provable distributed way that's cryptographically resilient to prove that that's the case, and that changes everything. So in other words, currently people trust systems because they have been trusting them in the past or because others trust them. And that's really not a good reason.
Well, also, you don't even know what the system is. I mean, we were just talking, I spent hours this morning looking at an interaction between Apple's cloud and Dropbox and Adobe. And I didn't even know that was going on until I spent an hour and researched it. And as the world gets more and more complicated, you really aren't going to know who's connected to your data, who's connected to your enterprise. So the trust that you have in that as a user is probably misplaced because you really don't know who's on the other end of it. And you would think, well, Uber, for instance, Uber's trustworthy. And they're not from this perspective. So you have to take it into your own hands, and it has to be a system that's easy to add, easy to integrate, and supports every imaginable Web 2, Web 3 node. And that's what they've done.
How far into the development are you? I guess it's always a work in progress. You're always creating and innovating, but how far down the journey are you with this?
So we have started some years ago, and we have done, as part of the accelerators that we ended up being finalists and winning, we have done a number of proof of concepts. So, this obviously, this works. This has been run in, banking infrastructure spaces, family office, critical spaces that manage hundreds of billions of dollars, all the way to, critical infrastructure mirrors. So, of course, we cannot operate on the production systems yet, and also on, very large enterprise environments, so multinationals. So we have done proof of concepts in very different and disparate spaces, including IoT, mobile, smart cars, robotics, stuff like that. So the use case really is like any digital device that can run something is a potential node, right? And the more it grows, the more resilient all the others become, right? So that's pretty much that. Right now, we are scaling up really, and you said it correctly. This is a never-ending, job. The organization is actually a DAO, so it's a decentralized autonomous organization, and this is going to be in the future driven by the community. Currently, we are in a constantly maturing situation. We're actually going to be releasing test nets before the end of the year, and we're going to continue to release test nets well into Q1, because there's actually different kinds of test nets that we release, from nodes to different kinds of validations and updates and different operating system supports and stuff like that. So yeah, that's pretty much where we are. So in other words, we are in a pre-production state, already quite mature. Protocol works well. We have, of course, a white paper and a lot of documentation on our blog, that in FAQs in the website that can answer many questions related to this if users are interested. And we will eventually have a public sale when the market flips again to a better condition. That's from a development perspective, everything, nothing is stopping, everything is moving forward. We are technically ready, just we cannot control the market, but we're going to continue moving forward.
We're hoping the market's going to probably turn after the winter. That's our thought process anyway, but we'll wait and see.
Fingers crossed across the listeners as well.
We always say that bear markets are for building, and we've spoken to some incredible projects and people that are building incredible things in this space. And I think that, if you can't build in a bear market because retail investors aren't buying tokens, then
let me tell you something about the bear market. Actually, I think it was quite a blessing for us.
Right.
We have never had as much interest in real tech as bear markets. So bear markets, they act as kind of like they take the fog away. So there's a lot of hype in this space and a lot of quote BS too, and there's a lot of shiny objects that are not necessarily good, right? And the market being down suddenly shifts things from the hype to the tech or the usability or value, let's say, or transformation. And that's really what we have seen, both from our partners and also from our investors. So we have raised a lot of capital, which now stands at about 33 million. In a very bear market.
Well, that's great. Congratulations. I mean, what's great about bear markets is that fundamentals actually matter. You have to have something that's good and works. Whereas in bull markets, you can almost sometimes just put any old crap out there and people will just say, hey, yeah, this is going to be incredible.
Well, I saw this happen with the .com bubble because
right, I'm sure
everybody was getting funded. My company did an IPO to secondaries, and I watched hundreds of companies getting venture funding, going public, 90% of which should never have gotten funded and certainly could have never gone public. And it made a lot of fortunes for people, but all the companies tanked. But then the next wave that came after them with Google and Amazon and eBay and E-Trade, I mean, these were companies that were actually doing real world things.
That was real value. Yeah.
They had value. They were solving a real problem. In 1999, I think it was, at one point there were, I think I have this number right, 17 venture-funded pet food companies online. There was the infamous Pets.com one, and there were all these other ones. There was a cat food company, a dog food company, and these things were public.
Yeah.
So then I didn't see this again until the ICOs a couple of years ago, when everybody and their brother were putting out a token
for dog food. If you
wasn't there was a restaurant that started selling tokens and claiming that they were a token economy. I mean, it was crazy.
I remember, for example, Kodak. And I also remember
Kodak. I forgot about that.
Kodak Coin. I also remember the what's the iced tea one?
Oh yeah. Uh-huh. but that of course naturally leads into a bear market, and it makes sense. And the companies like ours that come afterward are fundamentally sound, and they're addressing a real problem, and there's value there. Typically, like always, because there's technology and there's a business problem, and there's a good use case.
It's a very good point. And going back to what you said, there is a maturation curve, right? And just like in the .com boom era, in the beginning, I'm looking at it and it's like, okay, there's a lot of shenanigans. But after a while, it really matures and it becomes real. Like the technologies are real, Google is a thing, so on and so forth. And I think that's where we're reaching right now. I think there was never so good projects in the blockchain space or using blockchain technology as now. And we are in a very down market. Now, that doesn't necessarily mirror value, because it's a cyclical thing and it's very hypey and so on. Having said that, I think the good projects are being well funded regardless. And there is basically a filter that automatically happens.
Yeah, I would also point out with Web3 technologies, there's a latency. I mean, there's a certain amount of time it takes because it has to get baked into a bigger ecosystem. And that's what's going on all over the place with Web3 projects. They're not all standalone. They provide a function like Naoris, providing a security capability that just wasn't there before. And the adoption curve takes a while after that, but not that long.
Yeah. And how did you feel? It's a question for David. How did you feel managing and kind of like creating, setting up, pushing the DNS system, into maturity, and suddenly the world changes? Because of you.
It was fast. I mean, I got to Network Solutions in 1996, and we had how much was it? It was 50,000 domain names out there. And when I left in 2001, we had 10 million.
My word.
Yeah. And when I got there, we had 200,000, 300,000 records for accounts receivable. And we were using Microsoft Excel. We had this enormous spreadsheet. I didn't do that, but I walked in and they had apparently one of the biggest spreadsheets in the world. And they just started in a spreadsheet and they kept going. So we had to put a billing system into it. We had to put security. I had to deal with some of the very first cyber attacks, denial of service attacks, because all of a sudden there was digital things that had value. And before there wasn't. I mean, digital things weren't all that valuable. But domain names, business.com went for 7 million, sex.com went for 8 or 9 million. And there were these names that appeared very ephemeral. You could buy them for $30 online, and now they're worth millions of dollars.
Maybe tens of millions,
or tens,
not more, because this was very early on. This was like, what year was this?
This would have been, originally it started in 97, and then it went, and then ICANN got created in 2000. But and it happened fast. It seemed fast to me anyway. And I think the same thing's about to happen here. I don't think blockchain has even seen anything yet.
I agree.
I think cyber currencies, sure, but all the good blockchain stuff I know about is starting to get adopted now. And it's going to be a massive game changer in the next couple of years because it disintermediates a lot of institutional things, legal systems, contracts like Ethereum, with the contracts. And it's a very heady thing. What it does, it also breaks through international boundaries quite cleanly to the point where governments are scared. I mean, I talk to people in the US government and they're really, really nervous about what's going to happen out of DeFi, let alone cyber currencies. And they made, some Tumblr program is illegal now in the US. They don't want you to use them because then you have completely anonymous cyber cash transactions. So it's a little threatening. I guess that's the point.
Any technological transformation comes, again, there's other maturation curves that exist. Mm-hmm. Also, the regulator perspective is extremely slow. And I think that always happens when there's innovation. We're actually talking about that yesterday. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a trap here. And I think one of the reasons why there is a trap here is because there is a distinct lack of security. And regulators tend to, see that as a reason to regulate.
Right.
Security is such a huge issue, though, and it underlies almost every single technology-driven thing out there in the world. If you don't have good security, then, just think about self-driving cars. If you don't have good security on self-driving cars, they may turn into some Stephen King thing and just start killing people.
Yeah.
It's probably gonna happen.
Yeah.
Someone's gonna try that, aren't they? Some terrorist group. It's terrible to talk about, but that will happen, I'm sure, or people attempt to.
The more complexity these systems have, the quote, the more probability this has. So imagine a situation where, I hope this doesn't happen, but probably in some way it will. Like where, you have a fleet of tens of thousands of a certain model, and they all have a similar vulnerability, or they all receive a malicious package for an over-the-air update, because cars are basically servers on wheels.
Tesla.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you guys are sort of in the middle of answering my final question to you, really, is just about looking into the future. And, cybersecurity and cyber attacks now, these are, they're talked about a lot. And we've got nation states that are really concerned about major cyber attacks. What are the sort of blind spots going into the future? You mentioned self-driving cars, but what's the kind of worst case scenario here if security is not taken seriously?
I would say we are living through the worst case scenario. And the more we move forward, the worse the worst case scenario becomes, because the more things are connected and the more things are digitalized and the more complexity there is, without a governance structure that ignores that complexity or actually leverages that complexity to the benefit of the participants, let's say, which is really what we're doing. And I've thought about this very long and hard with other people as well. And we don't see an alternative for this problem to be solved. We'll always be kind of like whacking moles as they come out forever. And it can come to a point where, it just, there's let's just say large companies, right, are critical infrastructure to countries these days. So think of AT&T in the US and other they are connected to like the US Navy, the US Army. It's like the NSA, the FBI, the government. So if and potentially to other critical things that depend on other things that may control nukes, right? For example. So let's just say if an attacker takes over something that creates a cascading effect of either, illegal access or non-availability of something critical like the stock exchange or that allows to access to something that might create a conflict or whatever. These are not alien arguments. These are real world possibilities currently.
Yeah.
And if we don't do anything, and if we still keep the status quo, and again, I'm not saying what's being done is wrong. I'm saying what's being done is like best effort, but we really need to go completely above that from a different perspective, not necessarily substitute it, but fundamentally look at it in a different way. And that's what we're allowing for in order to mitigate these things, because they will happen. And this is not the panacea either. But there is it fundamentally changes the game from the principle that the more complexity you have, the more security potentially you have, the more resiliency you have, the more trust you know that you have from a system or an environment of environments that's currently siloed, very hard to manage. It relies a lot on human interaction. Humans are extremely fallible and very complex. That are a bunch of collection of points of failure towards the whole infrastructure.
Yeah, and as long as they're being scared of things, there's obviously a trend in the last 10, 20 years for digital devices to start controlling real world physical objects.
Oh yeah.
More and more, we say IoT, but this is self-driving cars, medical systems in hospitals, IoT.
I like to call it Internet of Trouble.
Yes, exactly. Drone. But as these things continue to become connected to some kind of network, they become very vulnerable. And just look at the WannaCry virus and what it did to a bunch of healthcare systems in the United Kingdom. I mean, it took entire hospitals off the grid.
Oh yeah, people died.
Oh, people actually died from that. Yeah, that's right. And the NotPetya one too. Yep. The same thing happened. Yep. So as these things become more complicated, I mean, imagine a drone that just gets taken over and starts firing missiles at completely wrong objects. Or those Boston Dynamics robot dogs.
Well, I think those things are insane. Have you seen them?
It's like Black Mirror, right?
It really is. I was just thinking that.
Yeah.
So they just made an agreement recently that said they promised not to put machine guns on the dogs' heads, which means they were thinking about it, right?
Oh, don't worry, the Chinese have done that already.
I'm sure.
It's I heard Charlie Brooker, the writer of Black Mirror, I think he said in an interview last year that he's going to stop writing Black Mirror now because nothing is more dystopian than the reality that we're all living in. So I think, you've only got to look at the Boston Dynamic robots to sort of see where we're going.
Oh, I'm sad and happy at the same time I don't know what to say.
Right.
But for example, the case of these robots with machine guns on their heads or whatever, right? I mean, drones. If you look at the conflict, and we have a number of generals in our board, and of course we talk to them. If you look at the conflict in Ukraine, war has fundamentally changed. I mean, cyber is now a war fighting domain. It's no longer it's a real thing. And then you have basically drone war, which is heavily influenced by cyber, which is arguably, the source of maybe, 20 to 30% of casualties.
I think cyber may be a bad term just to keep using because, there was a point where electricity looked important and then it became ubiquitous and we no longer talked about it.
We don't call it electricity.
Right. Well, I have an article somewhere from the New York Times saying that the best job in 1901 was going to be the CEO, which was the chief electrical officer. And they predicted that for like 100 years, everybody was going to be electrifying all these things. But it happened in 20 or 30, and then it became something you plugged in and you didn't need a chief electrical officer anymore. And I think cyber's like that too. There's going to be very few things that are not cyber friendly. I mean, we're almost at that point now.
Oh, yeah. But I think, even if you look at let's just look, for example, at some large hacks that happen in some of the most protected spaces in the world. So, for example, the SolarWinds hack, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good one.
So it's estimated that it will take years to potentially clear it up. And once all these systems are rebuilt, hundreds of thousands of systems, you still don't know if you kick the guys out or not. So there is a good value. And by the way, this system this attack probably ended up creating one of the biggest transfers of wealth ever, because most of the agencies and large companies that make up the U.S. national critical infrastructure were impacted by it, and the attackers were living off the land for months and months and months. So this again tells you how important it is for you to know that you can trust the things that you have and know if they're actually in a trusted situation or not, if their integrity is not tampered with, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually make an informed decision early on, because this attack probably took years to make, and prevent these sort of things into the future. So if you think about, and this is very important, I think, maybe to finish, cyber threats and damages around the world now account for about $6.3 trillion. Okay. And you're thinking, how much that? Like, that's more than all the dollars held by non-US countries in the world. Right. That's insane. Yeah. It's more than the reserve currency outside of the US, right? And this happens every year. And in 2025, it will probably be 10 trillion. And you think, how much that? That's like 6 or 7% of the world GDP. And we are marching towards in that direction, like at high speed. And if we don't change that direction, it's to our own detriment about all the things that we talked here. And of course, if 1% of this money was used for something good, the world would change. So our objective is really, and we say that, as an ethos sort of thing. We call it the hyperstructure ethos. But one of the things there is, we want to reduce this level of threats and damages by 1 order of magnitude in the next decade. And if we could do that, with the help of everybody, being a participant, a node, a validator, in a win-win, infrastructure of trust, that would be absolutely amazing. Not just for people, but for companies, for institutions, for trust in general. Because let's be honest, nobody knows if they can trust anything. They just assume they can't. Like, you don't trust the apps on your phone, you don't trust your providers.
You go a bit crazy if you think, I can't actually trust anything, right? I mean, you kind of have to have some faith in it to some regard. But I guess you're helping address that issue.
You see, the faith, as you say, you do have faith. People do have faith. But the reason why they have faith or trust is because they have had faith or others have faith. But this is not a good start.
Not a good measure, right? Not a good measure of whether something is trustable because 100,000 other people do. Yeah.
For anybody that's listening and they want to find out a little bit more about what you guys are doing and more about Naoris, we're recording this on the 7th of November, and I think the episode will probably be going out in a couple of weeks' time. But if people want to find out more about what you're doing, where can they go, and how can they start participating in what you're offering?
Right. So we have various channels from Discord to Telegram, etc., that can be found in our website, naoris.com. That's naoris.com, or naorisprotocol.com. There is a lot of general intelligence, both about the open source intelligence about our consensus mechanism, the connections that we have to, both military at NATO level or NATO members, and other partners that are also available, for free. Anybody can search for it on the internet and find details about that. We also have a white paper available on our website, a lot of FAQs, and generally a lot of documentation and analysis of conflicts from our perspective and other things in our blog that can also be accessed from the site. And I would, suggest people, if they have any question or they have interest to participate, help, or, participate in the future public sale, to join our Telegram or our Discord and follow us on Twitter.
The one thing I did want to point out about the previous discussion is people trust technology right now. They probably shouldn't. And technologists don't trust technology, but the average people kind of do. They know airplanes aren't going to fall out of the sky and robots aren't going to kill them. Probably. And if we get to the point where they stop trusting technology, I wonder what's going to happen next. And that's why what we're doing is so important.
I hope we don't get there.
I hope we don't get there too. But the only way we're not going to get there if we trust the centralized approach. Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. If we wait for them to do this for us, it's going to be a sad world we're going to be living in.
Well, we'll be also owned.
And we'll be owned, right. Yeah. There's that too.
Yeah. I mean, we talk about technology being a net positive for humanity all the time, and you're right. I mean, if ever the day comes where people don't trust the technology and don't trust the future technology, I think that's worrying.
Yeah, that's the beginning of the dark age of humanity. Right?
Yeah, that's actually that's my biggest worry. My biggest worry is a backlash by consumers against technology, and it could happen.
Yeah. Do you know, guys, this has actually been a really fascinating interview for me. I wish we could keep you around. I've got questions around cybersecurity and quantum computing and Neuralink. And I mean, I could go on and on. And yeah, exactly. I know you guys would have answers. I know you would. I mean, we'd love to have you back on the show sometime. I
think we should do a round 2 where we just geek out on things like that.
On cybersecurity generally.
I think
know
that'd be really fun, actually. And this has been really different for our listeners as well, because we haven't delved a huge amount into cybersecurity and some of these issues. So I think we've touched on lots of really important topics today. So yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for coming on the show. All the links to the project website, Twitter, Discord, etc. will all be in the show notes if you're listening. So yeah, let's chat early next year and see if we can do another show at some point.
We'd love to. Thank you so much, guys, for having us.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much,
you.
Guys.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. It would mean the world to us if you could leave a review wherever you're listening. This really does help and allows other people to find us online. You can keep up to date with new releases of the podcast by subscribing and following us on Twitter or Instagram for the latest crypto-related news. Information provided by Cryptopulse via this podcast, website, social media channels, and any other medium does not constitute financial advice, investment recommendations, or any other type of advice whatsoever. The Cryptopulse team are not professional financial advisors. Trading and purchasing cryptocurrencies do carry risks, and anybody wishing to partake in such activities should seek professional advice.